Okay, we are going to take a look at the techniques that we have for acrylic painting. On one sheet of the Bristol board, right, the cardstock that you have, divided into 12 sections. Within those 12 sections, check out the list of the types of techniques that we're going to use, and I'll go through them here so you can get a sense of what you'll be doing on the sheet. Some of this has to do with blending, color blending, application with various tools, what happens when you add white, etc. Okay, so let's start with opaque color. I have a selection of these from various students in the past, and some of these are done better than others. The point here with the opaque is to put down one color, let it dry, and then paint the other color over the top, right? Acrylic is different from watercolor in that it's less translucent or transparent than the watercolor. So when you put one color over the other, you will probably see, you can see a little bit of a color differential. So you know that yellow and blue make green. So this is where the blue went over the yellow after it dried. It's entirely possible to put down a color, let it dry entirely, and put on the next color so thick you don't even see it. Although my guess is that they didn't go over the other color at all. So you want to make sure that you have that overlap so you can see what happens to the color in between. Here's another successful one with the yellow and the red, making the orange in the middle. And again, this is with the yellow going over the top, as it's going to be easier to see the darker color through the lighter color, right, of the two. One of the things that I would recommend is that you pick two colors. So in this case, this would be the yellow and the blue, and you do this whole side with those two colors. And you can see how those two colors create the third all the way down. Part of this is the blending, and part of it is the application. So one of the things that we have for a tool to apply paint, in addition to a paintbrush, is a palette knife. And a palette knife has a flat surface and an edge that will let you really sort of glop on and add texture and create marks in the paint, or treat it a lot like frosting. You can kind of see that right up here, kind of looks like maybe frosting applied to a cake. Right? So palette knives can be done a bunch of different ways. And again, here's that texture happening again here. And this is just sort of dragging the palette knife through the thicker paint. And here's another one where it was sort of used to create sort of that smooth approach. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that and create different textures. Yeah, so that's palette knife application. The next thing that you can think about how to apply the paint is with a fork, believe it or not. If you want some good texture, maybe grass, maybe some branches somewhere, getting some nice thick paint and some grooves in that, you can really see that happening there. There's another one, and you can have a nice texture happening and create that in sort of a pattern. And it could maybe have some movement, a little bit of energy to it, vertical or horizontal. This is much thicker paint. This is the other thing too, is that acrylic paint actually can maintain its texture if you put it on right from the container without adding water, right? So we're not adding water to this, just straight on, and it'll sort of goop up a little bit. We can also add things to acrylic paint where you can have a thicker texture, but for right now, we're just going to deal with the paint itself. The next way that you might apply acrylic paint is with a dry brush. So this is just a little bit of paint on your brush. This is very smooth. This doesn't have the texture that the others do. It's much less paint being applied. And it can have the sort of wispy appeal because there isn't enough paint in the brush to make the bristles stick together. So this would give you that sort of brushy approach with a dry brush. So your brush would not have water. You get a little bit of paint. You brush it out on a side piece of paper, get most of it out, and then go ahead and apply this. So you might apply the yellow, let that dry a little bit, apply the blue, And the blending in here might be if the yellow's not quite dry, you can see how that might go together. Let's see, do we have another dry brush that was effective? No, not too bad. It's a little bit brushy, but you can see how there was more paint involved and maybe a little bit of water on that one. That's another fairly dry brush option, right? Slightly different approach handling that. Okay, the next thing that you can try actually will create an illusion of color change, and this is applying with one of your smaller brushes and applying dots. So if you start with just the red and then you have yellow on the far side, try not to get the red over here, or if you're doing yellow and blue, apply the dots and the illusion of color can happen in here. Now this you can see where the paint was wet and so it blended a little bit. Perhaps we have a better example. Maybe. But the idea is that where these dots combine, you might see more of a purple tone because your eye is creating the two colors together. So that's an option. Also, a similar feel is using a toothbrush and sort of dabbing the toothbrush first in the paint, getting most of it off, and then putting it on and applying those together as well. So a toothbrush can be used too. And a toothbrush might have, this one, might have a lot less paint and a more open feel. It might have more paint, like this one, and be a little denser, but you can see the pattern of the toothbrush bristles, right? So that's an option for you. Next, actually, let me skip down to one more down here in the corner. The sponge, and again, the order of this is less relevant. The sponge is a similar thing where we have sponges at school that will have torn up for you. And if you dab it in the paint and then dab it on a side piece of paper to get most of the paint out, you can create a sponge texture where the holes in the sponge create openings, and you can create a very interesting texture with those. And again, where the colors overlap, you may see the color change a little bit there. Let's see if I have one in a different color. Well, this one they did sort of the whole thing over each other, so you sort of see the texture one over the other. And I think the yellow went on solidly. So, sponge, that's another one. Next, I'm going to move to the wet on wet. So acrylic paint can be mixed with water a little bit. Again, on the side, you can do this on your palette paper, and the water creates a translucency with the acrylic paint. So it starts to look a little bit like watercolor. And this is where you can see where the two colors go together. Again, this is feeling very much like the watercolor glazing that we've done with the watercolors. Here's another one. You can see that translucency here. You see the white of the paper sort of peeking through, and you can see where one color is sort of overlapping the other. Those are successful. This one you can see that, but it's not put on evenly, so it's more difficult to see the translucency, particularly with the blue through the red. Here, where you can see the red through the blue. So that's the translucency with wet on wet. So again, you have a watered down version of the red and a watered down version of the blue, with the other one over the top. So they're not mixing in here, but one is going over the other. Okay, so those are some application techniques. Now the other side, we're going to take a look at mixing and blending right on the paper. So instead of mixing the color on the palette, you have the option for blending and creating sort of a gradient from one complement to another, right? So again, these are complementary colors. So this is not where you're doing the red and the yellow and making orange, but where you're looking at yellow and its complementary color purple and creating that neutral tone in the middle, which might be brownish or might be grayish, depending on the colors that you've mixed. Okay, so we want to have the two colors on either side and then gently blend them together to see what you can get for that neutral mid-tone. And try to do it in an even way so you have that nice sort of gradient transition through the neutral in the middle. So both of these are wet at the same time while you're doing that. Okay, so there's your blue and your orange. There's your red and your green. There's your, oh, okay. So those are the 3 sets of complements. Let's take a look at a couple others where folks did this. And you can see how one was maybe a little bit dry when they did it, and it didn't blend very well. And it just did a little bit of overlap. You really want that sort of gradient to happen from one set to the next. And try to do it in a way that's a little more even with the brush application, right? See if you can make that a smooth gradient with the paint a little bit more. All right, there we go. And you can see how this one we don't have a gradient at all. One is just sort of right up against the next. This one they do overlap, but it just sort of gives you that third color. So see what you can do about those gradients. Next, we're going to take a look about, pick any color you like, one that you happen to have left on your, that you've already squeezed out, because waste not, want not, right? Start with your color, and then start with a little bit of the black over here. We are still going to keep our black to a minimum, but we want to see what it does to a color to create the shade. So this here, and then you're going to, again, do that nice gradient where you blend from black to your original color to create the shade. And then ideally you'd use the same color, but you could use a different one. This one very nicely shows the gradation from the yellow to the white to get the tint. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of other people's versions of this. Some are less even and gradual. Again, this is going from your blue to your white. It says black, but it's white. And then from your color to your black. And again, this is sort of done in globs and not blending too particularly well. So you want to see what you can do to make that even. I think the first one was probably the best bet. This one's not too bad. You can see again there's a little bit of a gradient in there. And this one is very nice with the blue to the white. There's a little bit of blending, but there's not a lot. I think one dried, the blue probably dried a little bit before they got the black in there. And this is kind of interesting. It's going from the green to the white all the way across. It's a little bit of a better gradient. So this is what you're going to be doing for the techniques. When you're done, you will have a sheet of 12 different techniques labeled accordingly, and we will see how that goes for controlling the paint. And this will give us some options when we approach the self-portrait painting about how to control the paint and the colors as we move into the next level of the project.